Hey everybody, this is chapter 6 of Confronting Anti-Semitism on the Left, Arguments for Socialists by Daniel Randall. It's titled The Left and Jewish Community, Some Recent Trends. On the 25th of November 2019, Chief Rabbi Ephraim Mirvis wrote an article in the Times that asked the question, quote, "What will become of Jews and Judaism in Britain if the Labour Party forms the next government?" End quote. Although Mirvis wrote that it was not, quote, his place, end quote, to tell people how to vote, the article is in essence an impassioned plea not to vote for the Labour Party in the upcoming 12th of December election, arguing that Labour was a site of, quote, anti-Jewish racism, end quote, in which its leadership was, quote, complicit. Mirvis's opening claim was that, quote, the overwhelming majority of British Jews, were, end bracket, gripped with anxiety, end quote, about the election and the prospect of a Labour government. The data backed this up. Polling from March 2019 showed that 87% of Jews viewed Jeremy Corbyn as anti-Semitic. 42% said they would consider emigrating if Labour won, and 61% believed there were, quote, high levels of anti-Semitism, end quote, within the Labour Party. Any leftist, or even secular liberal, should be alarmed by a direct intervention into politics of any clerical figure. But any serious leftist should also be alarmed by those statistics. I campaigned for Labour in the 2019 election. I think Mirvis was wrong, and I think the anxiety he was speaking to, while undeniably real, was misplaced. These issues around Jewish fears about the election were explored in my exchange with the writer and activist Randall Sikdar, which appeared as an appendix in this book. For the Labour-supporting left, to ease this anxiety required sensitivity to its origins and an acknowledgement that it was grounded in inherited cultural memory of historical experience and that it was a response to actually existing anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. It required sensitivity to the fact that, as much as we on the left might wish it were otherwise, when Mirvis made his statement, he was, as far as could reasonably be ascertained, speaking for most Jews in Britain, at least in the sense of expressing opinions that it seemed most Jews shared. The required sensitivity was not universally forthcoming. In a tweet that was later deleted, a staff member for the Labour left group Momentum responded to Mirvis by suggesting, quote, Chief Rabbi Ephraim Mirvis is a Boris Johnson supporter. He's also an uncritical supporter of Netanyahu and the violent oppression of Palestinians by Israel. Labour is promising to recognize a Palestinian state and end arms sales to Israel. His comments must be taken in that context, end quote. Other responses on websites such as Counterpunch, Vox Political, and The Canary made similar arguments. One second. The first instinct was thus not to address the substance of Mirvis's claims, but to allege he was making them essentially because of his desire to perpetuate the oppression of the Palestinians, ensure the continuation of arms sales to Israel, and return a Tory government. This is the rhetorical sleight of hand that allows much of the left to avoid any serious engagement with anti-Semitism at all. If a Jew supports Israel, then what they say about anti-Semitism must have the ulterior motive of deflecting criticism of Israel. And since the vast majority of Jews do have some affinity with and support for Israel, then the vast majority of Jewish concerns about anti-Semitism can be ruled out and dismissed. Mirvis may well have been politically motivated to oppose Corbyn and prevent a Labour government. He is, after all, the chief rabbi of the United Hebrew Congregations of the Commonwealth, an establishment figure if there ever was one. He may well be a Tory, but does this mean the issues raised in his article can be automatically dismissed? Does the fact that he might also have other reasons for opposing labor mean the one at the center of his article, concerns about anti-Semitism, is necessarily not, quote, real, end quote? New section, Selective Philo-Semitism. The pro-Corbyn website Squawkbox, which had a famously close relationship with Corbyn's office throughout his leadership, responded to Mervis's statement by publishing a letter from United European Jews, a Charedi ultra-Orthodox organization that, quote, totally rejected and condemned, end quote, the chief rabbi's statement. This represented a continuation of a peculiar sort of selective philo-Semitism, that is, an ostentatiously pro-Jewish attitude performed by non-Jews based on notions of an essential Jewishness. It had developed, mobilizing the opinions of a small layer of vocally pro-Corbyn Charedi figures against the criticisms leveled by more mainstream communal voices. The left has frequently taken sides in political, social, and especially class struggles within ethnic and religious communities. Traditionally, this has been to support socialist, secularist, feminist, LGBT plus people, workers in struggle, and other dissidents within those communities, fighting for greater freedom against the frequently conservative values of the community leadership. In Squawkbox's selective philo-Semitism, a surreal adjunct to contemporary left anti-Semitism, we find that tradition inverted, and a section of the left boosting some of the most reactionary, misogynist, homophobic, and patriarchal elements of Jewish life. The nearest thing we find to this phenomenon in recent leftist history is the episode, stretching from around 2001 to 2005, where sections of the far left opportunistically courted right-wing communalists within Muslim communities in the Stop the War Coalition and the Respect Electoral Initiative, much to the vocal dismay of some secularists and leftists from Muslim backgrounds. Steve Cohen denounced this approach, whether in relation to Muslim communities or Jewish ones, as, quote, reliance on a self-appointed leadership, end quote, which Steve Cohen argued was, quote, an apolitical disease which needs to be challenged and destroyed. Instead, sections of the left are cultivating it at its most dangerous points, end quote. Although Squawkbox promoted in the United European Jews an alternative, quote, self-appointed leadership, end quote, to the mainstream Board of Deputies, their approach expressed the same communalist logic. Squawkbox made a particular hero out of Shraga Stern, a Charedi activist aligned with the Union of Orthodox Hebrew Congregations, who was especially outspoken in his denial of labor anti-Semitism, and who particularly endeared himself to some of the left with his plan to organize a protest at a dinner organized by the Board of Deputies of British Jews, the most prominent cross-denominational Jewish communal organization, in November 2018. The other primary focus of Stern's activism is educational issues, where he campaigns vigorously against LGBT-inclusive education. In 2019, he donated £500 to campaigns by some Muslim parents to end such education in a Birmingham primary school. By boosting Charedi claims that mainstream communal bodies like the Board of Deputies are not representative, Squawkbox and others found another way to discredit claims of anti-Semitism without having to engage with their substance. If the Board of Deputies and the Chief Rabbi don't really represent Jews, they cannot be trusted when they say Jews are concerned about anti-Semitism and labor. The implication of this promotion of ultra-Orthodox voices is that these Jews, black hat wearing and bearded sporting peyos, the sidelocks worn by ultra-Orthodox men, zealously devout, are the real Jews, and those Jews who are secular, or at least not immediately identifiable as Jews, and whose Jewishness may consist in a complex cultural consciousness more so than the performance of religious ritual, are less authentic, less legitimately Jewish. Steve Cohen wrote that, quote, the left's advice to Jews, end quote, was, quote, assimilate and stop being Jewish, end quote. Steve Cohen's argument was that the non-Jewish left could not cope with the complexities and contradictions posed by historically accumulated Jewish culture and experience, and advocated a kind of blank assimilationism in the hope of making the problem go away. In a peculiarly inverted form, his argument serves as a pointed rebuttal to selective philo-Semitism of the squawk box type. In that particular case, quote, the left's advice to Jews, end quote, appeared to be, quote, don't assimilate. Express your Jewishness in an authentically sanctioned, purely religious form, end quote. Thus, this particular variant of left anti-Semitism is able to keep Jews where it can see them, in the immediately, visibly identifiable status of the marginalized outsider, without muddying the waters with complicated ethnic identities that might not be expressed through clothing or religious belief, but through attitudes to collective history. It was an abject position for would-be leftists to take, and was colluded in by people who ought to have known better. Historically, the primary sphere of political conflict for many Jewish leftists, including those from non- and anti-Zionist traditions such as Bundism, would have precisely been against the equivalents of Schraga Stern and the forces of religious ultra-reaction within their communities. And yet Jewish Voice for Labor, which claimed to stand in the tradition of non-Zionist Jewish leftism, boosted and recirculated Squawk Box's philo-Semitic tokenizing of Schraga Stern, affirming the central criticism leveled at them, that, far from being a group promoting labor movement organization and socialist politics within Jewish life, their primary purpose was to provide a Jewish-branded denialist chorus to deflect allegations of anti-Semitism. Jewish political opinion, and indeed Jewishness as a broad cultural category, is, of course, diverse. There is no default identity and viewpoint to which all Jews should be expected to conform, and there is nothing wrong with promoting highly minoritarian and marginal voices and political elements within a community because you agree with them, and because you hope the minority may one day be able to convince the majority. That is what any of us on the left are doing whenever we promote the struggles of small socialist groups in other countries. But is that what Squawk Box and Jewish Voice for Labor are doing with Schraga Stern? Do these leftists really hope Charedi and Hasidic sects become the majority in Jewish life, with all that would entail for women's rights, LGBT plus rights, and more? Indeed, with all it would entail for secularist and leftist Jewish currents? A committed Charedi activist might well dismiss the entire notion that the overwhelmingly secular Jewish Voice for Labor could possibly represent a legitimate, quote, Jewish voice, end quote. Thus, Jewish Voice for Labor, desperate to amplify arguments insisting that anti-Semitism in labor was not an issue, assisted in the promotion of people who quite probably denied Jewish Voice for Labor activists' right to speak as Jews. The point here is not to downplay the importance of Jewish diversity or to claim that Schraga Stern's unquestionably reactionary wider politics automatically invalidate what he has to say about anti-Semitism in the Labor Party. Schraga Stern's claims should be judged on their substance, but the denialists judged neither Stern nor Mervis on this basis. Mervis was dismissed out of hand, and claims about his reactionary politics were used to invalidate everything he had to say, while Stern was lauded despite his reactionary politics, which are quite considerably more reactionary than Mervis's, because he affirmed what the Squawk Box / Jewish Voice for Labor milieu already believed about anti-Semitism on the left, and allowed them to promote a figure who conformed to an ultra and authentic image of Jewishness whose pronouncements could be used to salve the conscience of the majority non-Jewish left. Here, too, we find unavoidable crossovers with the politics of Israel-Palestine. Shraga Stern is explicitly anti-Zionist. Shraga Stern calls mainstream Jewish communal groups such as the Board of Deputies and the Jewish Leadership Council, quote, extremist Zionist, end quote, groups. But his form of ultra-religious anti-Zionism has reactionary rather than progressive motivations. The religious fundamentalist critique of Israel is, in essence, that only divine will and the coming of the Messiah can establish a Jewish state, and that the establishment of the modern nation-state of Israel, on the basis of a largely secular nationalism, on the basis of a largely secular nationalism, is a crime against God's will. It has nothing to do with support for Palestinian rights or opposition to national oppression motivated by advocacy of equal rights. But for a section of the left, the mere label, quote, anti-Zionist, end quote, is enough to bestow political legitimacy, regardless of whether the alternative in the name of which Zionism is opposed is any better from a left-wing point of view. It allows left anti-Semitism to maintain its implicit claim that, quote, Jews, end quote, and, quote, Zionists are, in Con Harris's phrase, quote, two entirely separate categories of persons, end quote. The lauding of the marginal ultra-Orthodox sect, Neturei Karta, NK, by some leftists, is an expression of the same phenomenon. Like Stern, Neturei Karta provides those keen to deny or downplay left anti-Semitism with a seemingly authentic expression of Jewishness, which proclaims itself as such, that they can point to in their defense. Neturei Karta refer to themselves as, quote, Torah true Jews, end quote, and use such slogans as, quote, authentic Judaism opposes Zionist aggression, end quote. As the Israeli academic Eldad Levy, writing in the radical Israeli Palestinian Plus 972 magazine, put it, quote, the fact that a rigorous Jewish sect officially denounces the existence of Israel and joins efforts with the Palestinian national struggle has a symbolic political gain, ... The use of Neturei Karta as, quote, Jews opposing Israel, end quote, is heavily tokenized to achieve a political goal, end quote. When not attending pro-Palestinian protests, Neturei Karta members have participated in Holocaust denial conferences hosted by the Iranian state, mobilized in London to support the leaders of the Hungarian fascist group Jobbik, Jobbik, which Neturei Karta admires for its anti-Zionism, and have been photographed performing the quenelle, the inverted Nazi salute, popular among anti-Semites in France. In 1991, an Neturei Karta rabbis sat down for a convivial, sympathetic interview with Patrick Harrington, a far-right political activist and sometime member of the National Front. As Spencer Sunshine put it rightly, Neturei Karta is, quote, the Jewish equivalent of the Westboro Baptist Church, end quote. But for some of the left-wing arbiters of authentic Jewishness, none of this is enough to put Neturei Karta off limits. Spencer Sunshine points out, quote, the left would never hold up the 8% of black voters who supported Trump as representing the black community. In fact, when Trumpists put black supporters front and center, the left understands their opinions are not those of the majority of black Americans. So, since the Jewish community as a whole appears not to not want Israel to be abolished, why does the left hold up the tiny minority of anti-Zionist Jews as representative of the Jewish community? They are being used as tokens by the larger left, that refuses to engage in Jewish issues or to confront anti-Semitism, end quote. New section, blaming Jews for anti-Semitism. A common theme of recent denialist discourse on left anti-Semitism, additional to arguments that deny or downplay anti-Semitism entirely, are arguments that acknowledge its existence and significance, but lay the blame for it at the feet of Jewish communities and institutions themselves. Sometimes this has been expressed in the horrid claim that Israel's actions are the root cause of anti-Semitism. As a Morning Star article, later withdrawn and apologized for by the paper's editors, put it, quote, surely the Jewish organizations and individuals who lately were protesting about growing anti-Semitism in Britain must see that, as advocates of Israel's historical and still unremitting brutality against the Palestinians, they will inevitably be regarded by some other British nationals as directly complicit in that country's actions, ... No amount of protestations about the symptoms of rising anti-Semitism, ... will end the problem until its root cause, Israel's criminal behavior, is dealt with, end quote. The Morning Star. This repeated an old theme of left anti-Semitism. That anti-Semitism was perhaps tacitly ill-judged, but ultimately understandable response to Israel's actions. Norman Garris calls this the Israel alibi, while advancing a straightforward lie that, quote, the Jewish organizations and individuals, ... protesting anti-Semitism, end quote, were, in a direct and unqualified sense, quote, advocates of Israel's ... brutality against the Palestinians, end quote. In fact, the formal policy of most mainstream Jewish communal organizations is against the occupation of Palestinian territories and for the establishment of an independent Palestinian state. The Board of Deputies' policy is, quote, promote peace projects that unite communities and resist boycotts that divide communities, advocating for a permanent and comprehensive solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that results in a secure Israel alongside a viable Palestinian state, end quote. It is surely fair to criticize it for failing to actually advance that policy, which effectively exists on paper only, and does not seem to inform the board's official response to events in Israel-Palestine, which often express knee-jerk defenses of Israel. In May 2020, for instance, an open letter from 38 deputies did just that, when they urged the board to take a firm stance against the annexation of Palestinian territories. The following year, numerous deputies pressed the board to oppose Israel's bombing of Gaza and criticized the board's president for speaking at a pro-Israel rally. Describing mainstream Jewish communal bodies as, quote, advocates of brutality against Palestinians, end quote, is not only inaccurate, it erases and undermines the efforts of progressive voices within such bodies, and even if it were the case that every Jewish organization protesting anti-Semitism was a direct, quote, advocate, end quote, of Israel's policy, that would not mean the anti-Semitism they protested did not exist, still less than it was justified. Bigotry is not an acceptable or illegitimate response to bigotry. I want to repeat that because that's very important. Bigotry is not an acceptable or legitimate response to bigotry. Some on the left go further and argue that anti-Semitism is not only fueled by Israel's actions, but created by Israel's actions. Tariq Ali's May 2021 speech at a protest against Israel's bombing of Gaza argued, quote, every time they bomb Gaza, every time they attack Jerusalem, that is what creates anti-Semitism. Stop it. Stop the occupation, stop the bombings, and the casual anti-Semitism will soon disappear, end quote. Tariq Ali. Now, Imagine if that was same thing was said about Japanese people in the United States in World War II, or German people for that matter, or any national groups. Like, oh yeah, the government you're doing is associated with your ethnic identity is doing bad things. Therefore, uh, you know, prejudice against you is just a natural consequence of what your government is doing. So, like, if you want Japanese people to not be persecuted, uh, you should make your entire thing the defamation of Japan. Not that they not It's not that Jewish people and Japanese people shouldn't criticize vehemently policies and actions of states uh, that are the Japanese state or the Jewish state. But to act as if like prejudice against a group is somehow acceptable or explain or just easily understandable or understandable in the sense of sympathy, um, or like granting it a reasonableness to it is completely unacceptable. In my measly opinion. Back to the text. Ali's formulation is a gross caricature of Mahmud Darwish's sentiments discussed in Chapter 5 about the interrelation between the Jewish and Palestinian questions. Ali jettisons the whole history of pre-1948 anti-Semitism and sees Israel, conceptually fused with the Jews, standing outside of history, with, quote, anti-Semitism, end quote, something that is only, quote, created, end quote, in response to Israel's actions, with no internal dynamics of its own. As Con Harris responded, quote, even if you assume that anti-Semitism is simply a reaction to things Jews do and believe, which, rest assured, I do not, no social phenomenon is simply, quote, reversible, end quote. Racism has its own dynamic that persists beyond its origins. That, after all, is why the anti-Semitic, quote, Christ killer, end quote, trope persists among people who are not Christians. And that's why, if Israel and Zionism were, quote, defeated, end quote, whatever that would look like, the anti-Semitism it, quote, provoked, end quote, again, a simplistic assumption, would persist, end quote. As an additional, quote, blame the Jews, end quote, angle came from those who worried about the prospect of labor voters turning on the Jewish community for having sabotaged the prospect of a Corbyn-led government. Quote, what if Corbyn loses by a narrow margin? How will the millions who voted for him see the Jewish community and his 3-year campaign to brand him toxic, end quote, asked Robert Cohen in an article entitled, quote, the British establishment's, quote, war against Corbyn, end quote, risks bringing real anti-Semitism to Britain, end quote. The argument was that while the anti-Semitism currently being complained about was substantially not, quote, real, the anti-Semitism provoked as a backlash might be, ... but it would be, quote, self-inflicted, end quote. Quote, we are, ... on a path that risks turning fake anti-Semitism into real anti-Semitism. What we are witnessing could be an oncoming self-inflicted tragedy for the Jewish community in Britain, end quote, Cohen wrote. The article also asserted that the Jewish community leadership, quote, only have one issue on their mind, Israel, and how best to protect it from criticism, end quote. This assertion reflected an attitude sometimes encountered on the left towards Jewish communal organizations that see them all as part of an interconnected and monolithic effort to advance Israeli state interests. This thinking starts from the institutional connections between some Jewish communal organizations and bodies linked to the Israeli state, and extrapolates an argument that those bodies function solely as instruments of an Israeli power that aims to, as the sociology professor David Miller, previously mentioned in Chapter 1, argues, quote, impose its will all over the world, end quote. A diagram produced by David Miller encapsulated this view. It included entries for most major mainstream Jewish communal bodies, including the Board of Deputies, which was described as, quote, a key Israeli lobby group, end quote. Numerous Jewish individuals were also included, with linking labels such as, quote, donor, quote, affiliate, and, quote, within, with, quote, the Israeli government, end quote, and its, quote, quasi-state institutions, end quote, sitting atop the whole web. As stated in Chapter 1, David Miller even saw interfaith activities that brought Jews and Muslims together to make chicken soup as an effort to promote Israeli power and, quote, normalize Zionism. As Keith Kahn Harris wrote in response, this approach, quote, constructs a kind of, quote, flatland, end quote, a world in which networks of power and influence are so intricately connected that they form a seamless system, end quote. Any attempt to draw a distinction between, quote, Zionists and, quote, Jews is meaningless when anyone connected to the principal infrastructure of Jewish communal life can be seen as an agent of an Israeli state project for world domination. This wild conspiracy mongering does nothing to advance the struggle for Palestinian national rights. All it trains activists to do is engage in a Jew hunt, targeting Jewish individuals and organizations to reveal the promotion of Israeli power, for which even something as seemingly innocuous as interfaith chicken soup preparation must be a vehicle. Even those organizations more directly linked to the actual prosecution of Israeli state policy are the equivalents of political and cultural organizations that most, if not all, states use to pursue their geopolitical interests. Only for the Jewish state do conspiracy theorist anti-Zionists see in such activity a compact network pursuing a project not merely to advance interest, but to achieve global domination and control, to, quote, impose its will all over the world, end quote. As argued in Chapter 2, Zionism is thus reified into a single entity capable of embodying agency. As the socialist activist Kathy Nugent wrote, quote, reification is at the heart of conspiracy thinking, and that often brings left anti-Semitism into alignment with, quote, traditional, end quote, anti-Semitism, end quote. Had David Miller been an academic in the USSR, or its satellites in the 1950s, 60s, or 70s, his work might have well been celebrated and amplified by the state, whose campaigns of conspiracy theorist anti-Zionism it resembles. Responding to the 2021 controversy around Miller's work, an article on the left-wing Jewish website, Jewdas, Jewdas, said, quote, Miller's writings on Jewish institutions contain few outright falsehoods, but they are embarrassingly conspiratorial, significantly overstating the influence and aims of various organizations, end quote. The article continued, quote, it's tempting to blame the ills of the British government on a small, powerful group of people manipulating our politicians, end quote, but counseled the left to, quote, remember that the UK isn't pro-Israel and anti-Muslim because of a well-organized Jewish lobby, end quote, but rather because of the British state's own imperialist policy and state-sanctioned racism. New section, Jewish left traditions. Like many leftist Jews, I find wrangling, often conducted vicariously over questions of Jewish communal representation, leadership, and identity, highly unseemly. In many ways, it represents a mirroring of debate on terrain the left has no business occupying in the first place, but has allowed itself to become bogged down in by much of its own accommodations with forms of identitarian politics. If you accept an identitarian logic, wherein the identity of the sayer can confer validity on an argument, in abstraction from the substance of what is actually being said, You utterly inhibit your own ability to assess and intervene in political discourse on an independent basis, and necessarily limit yourself to an unseemly quest for an appropriate token person. Who will allow you to argue that your Jew is the really authentic, quote, Jewish voice, end quote. I oppose communalism. I believe the idea of a unitary interest for ethnic groups is dangerous, and I believe the social role of official community leaderships, especially in faith groups, is often reactionary. I contest the claims of the chief rabbi or the board of deputies to represent Jews, not because I don't believe they are authentically representative, or because I have an allegedly more representative alternative to supplant them with, but because I contest the idea of communal representation as such. I am also a secularist and an atheist, and as much as I defended the necessity to engage seriously with the contents of the chief rabbi's article, I was also alarmed by the fact of it. Direct interventions into politics by unchecked clerics have necessarily anti-democratic implications. I believe organized religion should play no role in political life. In all of this, I identify the rich secularist, anti-clerical, and anti-theistic traditions present in historic Jewish leftism. In the Jewish East End of London the late 19th century, radical Yiddish newspapers like Arbeiter Freund, Workers' Friend, were part of a vibrant Jewish anarchist and socialist milieu. Individuals and groups from this milieu frequently had an ostentatiously irreverent attitude to the bourgeois communal and rabbinical establishments and to organized religion itself. Arbeiter Freund mounted a, quote, non-stop verbal assault on religion and its institutions, end quote. In 1889, on Yom Kippur, one of the holiest days in the Jewish religious calendar, when believers spend the day fasting and at prayer, supporters of the paper organized a mass meeting, followed by a ball. At the meeting, lectures on, quote, the absurdity of religion, end quote, were given, and Arbeiter Freund journalist Benjamin Feigenbaum, who had been educated in a yeshiva, religious college, but became a dedicated freethinker and secularist, gave a lecture entitled, quote, Is There a God, end quote, which he concluded by proclaiming, quote, If there is a God, and if God is almighty, as the clergy claims he is, I give him just 2 minutes' time to kill me on the spot, so that he may prove his existence, end quote. When the time elapsed, he exclaimed, quote, See, there is no God, end quote. A band struck up La Marseillaise, and the ball began. I always forget how to say that. I think that's how you say it. Jewish leftists in other cities, including New York, also organized Yom Kippur balls, quote, a gesture of contempt for ancient superstitions, end quote, that allowed for the expression of a Jewishness that was irreligious and radical. Some young Jewish anarchists went so far as to, quote, march in column to Spittlefield's great synagogue, Machzikai Ha-Dat, in Brick Lane, smoking or brandishing ham sandwiches as gestures of defiance and rejection of religion. While it should be noted that many in the movement at the time felt these anti-religious provocations were counterproductive, such vignettes communicate a sense of the bombastically irreverent and iconoclastic attitude towards the official clerical and communal leaders that pervaded much of the Jewish radical milieu. I will not be so presumptuous as to mobilize Benjamin Feigenbaum in support of all the arguments I make in this chapter. He might well have been far more scathing and dismissive of Chief Rabbi than I have been, but I feel confident that, were he alive today, he would react with contempt to people who claim to occupy the radical left of Jewish life, celebrating the likes of Shraga Stern and Neturei Karta, and with disgust at the spectacle of non-Jews, implicitly telling Jews that they should look to Stern and Neturei Karta for political leadership. The agitation of Feigenbaum and others took place in a particular social context. A far-left milieu that was embedded in an immigrant community, made up of people from that community, competing with bourgeois community leaders and the religious establishment for ideological hegemony over the community's working class. Our context is different. A compact Jewish working class with an organized left no longer exists in Britain in the way it did in the 19th and early 20th centuries. The intervening years have wrought significant changes on Jewish demography, socioeconomic status, identity, and consciousness. Despite having been known to enjoy a bacon roll of a Saturday morning, I do not advocate that anyone today, Jewish or not, quote, brandish ham sandwiches, end quote, outside their local synagogue. I invoke the free spirit of Feigenbaum and the Arbeiterfreund not to advocate the direct replication of their methods, although I will happily collaborate with any comrades interested in organizing a Yom Kippur ball in the future, but to show that there is an alternative framework for thinking about the ethno-religious communities, those currently prevalent on the left. That framework understands communities neither as, quote, flatlands, end quote, nor as having an essential unitary interest that can be expressed if only the purest, most, quote, authentic, end quote, representative can be identified. Rather, it sees them as sites of struggle and ideological conflict, get riven by differences of class and oppression along lines of gender and sexual equality, and sexuality. Jesus Christ. Rather, it sees them as sites of struggle and ideological conflict, driven by differences of class and oppression along lines of gender and sexuality, in which the left should intervene to support those fighting for freedom. That framework has largely receded from left-wing common sense. Significant sections of the left have, in the past 2 decades, opportunistically accommodated to communalism, directly and explicitly, via the 2001 to 2005 alliance with the Muslim communalist forces already mentioned, and in an indirect way in the 2015 to 2019 period, contesting the claims of the chief rabbi and the board of deputies on behalf of a more reactionary communalist alternative. Conversely, those in the Labour Party and beyond who insisted that whatever the chief rabbi and the board of deputies said was beyond question or challenge, because they spoke for Jews in an immutable way, were also expressing a communalist logic. While there are no direct modern analogs of the Arbeiterfreund in similar publications and organizations, and while there is not a combative Jewish workers' movement engaged in direct class struggle, there are live struggles in the political left inside the Jewish community that could benefit from solidarity and amplification from the wider, predominantly non-Jewish, left. Non-Jewish leftists may be aware of the Jewish Socialist Group, which identifies with Bundism, and the politically heterogeneous cultural collective Judas, already mentioned in this chapter. Both of these have done valuable and respect-worthy work, although both have tended to downplay left anti-Semitism, and in particular the possibility of a link between left anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. There is a small British supporters group of Meretz, a left Zionist party in Israel, which has hosted events with Hussam Zomlot, the Palestinian ambassador to the UK. Even the Jewish labor movement, generally on the right of the Labour Party, is itself a site of ideological conflict and hosted Palestinian activist Gadir Hani at its 2020 conference. Although the Jewish labor movement is a frequent target for left anti-Semitic ire and appears on David Miller's diagrammatic representation of Israel's alleged plot for domination, the Jewish labor movement has its own left wing, which competes ideologically with more conservative elements. I should say that Jewish labor movement is like an organization, not just like Jewish labor movement generally conceived. Uncritically pro-Israel elements are by no means hegemonic in Jewish labor movement. In May 2021, Jewish labor movement issued a clear statement of condemnation of Israeli, quote, brutality, end quote, towards Palestinians on Temple Mount, and said, quote, the tensions in Israel have been heightened due to threatened evictions of Palestinian families from Sheikh Jarrah. We are entirely opposed to efforts to expand settlements, demolish homes, and evict Palestinians, and will continue to work with all who promote peace, human rights, security, and dignity for Israelis and Palestinians, end quote. A left that sees even critical-minded people within the Jewish labor movement as beyond the pale, enemies, even agents of Israeli domination, but will laud the likes of Shraga Stern, is a left that has utterly lost its political bearings. Beyond what might be termed the organized Jewish political left, there are charities like Mavar and Gesher EU, which help Charedi Jews escape the frequently highly oppressive conditions of ultra-Orthodox communities, and campaigning networks such as Yahad and Na'amad, which organize predominantly young Jews to protest the Israeli occupation. All of these and others do their work in the face of suspicion, hostility, and harassment from right-wing and reactionary elements within Jewish communities. The politics of these communities are often liberal rather than socialist, and in each case there will be aspects of their perspectives and approach with which, depending on their own particular points of view, leftists may disagree for a number of reasons. They have a variety of political approaches to communal representation, Israel-Palestine, and other questions. Some, like the Jewish labor movement, Meretz UK, and Yahad, self-identify as Zionist, but all, in different ways, are engaged in struggles to advance values and ideas the left should fundamentally support. The status of some such organizations as charities makes a direct relationship between them and more formally political bodies difficult, but the left can and should amplify and support their work, critically where necessary, and seek to engage their supporters in discussions about wider left-wing ideas. As the 2020-21 anti-occupation and anti-war agitation by board deputies showed, even more official and establishment communal organizations can be sites of political contestation. In April 2021, Noam, the official youth wing of the Masorti movement, one of the branches of organized Judaism in Britain, protested the Masorti leadership's hosting of Tzipi Hotoveli, the Israeli ambassador to the UK, and boycotted a meeting with her over Hotoveli's history of racist remarks towards Palestinians and reactionary attitudes on some religious and social questions. Noam's statement said, quote, "We are a Zionist youth movement. We believe in the importance of engaging with Israel as it is, with all the joys and challenges which come with that. Despite this, we feel that Hotoveli's comments are beyond the pale," end quote. Masorti Judaism, to which Noam is formally linked, is affiliated to or represented on several of the bodies that appear on Miller's diagram, including the Board of Deputies and the Jewish Leadership Council. So too is Liberal Judaism, whose youth wing, LJY Netzer, another Zionist organization, took a strong stance against war and occupation and for equality during Israel's bombardment of Gaza in May 2021. In doing so, they explicitly and vocally challenged the Board of Deputies, the Zionist Federation, and the Jewish Leadership Council's responses. The Board of Deputies have promoted the hashtag, quote, "No to rockets, yes to peace," without saying anything explicit about Israel's bombing. Perhaps, for Miller and his supporters and co-thinkers, anti-racist and anti-war protests by Zionists of Noam and NJY Netzer, which, in the context of Jewish communal organization as a contested terrain, were courageous and laudable stands. Were not really anti-racist and anti-war at all, but merely further attempts to extend Israeli influence and, quote, "normalize Zionism," end quote, by suggesting Zionists could oppose anti-Palestinian racism, occupation, and war. A left that upholds Miller's conspiracy theorist, quote, flatland, even in diluted forms, will inevitably fail in its duty of solidarity to those engaged in progressive struggle within the Jewish community. The left could also boost left-wing voices inside the international Jewish inside the left could also boost left-wing voices inside international Jewish life by promoting solidarity with the labor movement and internationalist left in Israel itself, including groups like Umdim Be-Yahad, Koa Le Ovdim, Power to the Workers, and Workers' Advice Center, WAC Ma'an, who struggle in extremely adverse circumstances. Much of the left is inhibited from such solidarity because of its implicit rejection of any progressive potential from within Israeli society, and its refusal to see any Israel other than that of Netanyahu and Hoteveli. New section. Solidarity, a challenge for the left. The left should heed the words of the Palestinian socialist activist Maysam Jaljouli, who said, quote, "We need to convince Jewish citizens, including Zionists, that the only way to change the regime in Israel, to change the government, to change society, is as part of a class-based alliance with not only Arabs, but which also includes Ethiopian communities, poor Jews from the former Soviet states, and other marginalized groups. They all need to be part of the struggle to change the regime. That's the basis for building a new left," end quote. Maysam Jaljouli. Supporting those efforts and encouraging diaspora support for leftist and progressive struggles in Israel itself would be a far better intervention into Jewish communal life than promoting a religious fundamentalist anti-Zionist fringe, or, wilder still, by implicitly designating the entire Jewish community as a, quote, enemy, end quote, agent of a conspiracy for world domination. As a movement aspiring to political hegemony, the left is necessarily required to contest existing hegemonic politics, including in minority communities. This often also involves contesting the existing political construction of minority identities. But without sensitivity to the roots of those political constructs, the door is open to bigotry. As Con Harris puts it, quote, "It is not intrinsically racist to oppose the politics of a particular minority or section of a minority. What is racist is denying that such political identities exist, to refuse to recognize the ways in which Jews and others treat Zionism and other political projects as part of their very being. That doesn't mean accepting or supporting that politics. It means finding a form of civility that can somehow balance a recognition of the nexus of politics and identity with advocating an alternative politics. The left gains the ability, and in a sense the right, to effectively intervene." Sorry, did I say end quote? End quote. Con Harris. The left gains the ability, and in a sense the right, to effectively intervene in and contest the politics of minority communities only when it defends those minority communities from bigotry, and consistently supports the right of those communities to free speech, even when that speech is used to make claims with which we on the left disagree. On the whole, the left, and especially the squawk box wing of the labor left, has not fulfilled these duties of solidarity, instead amplifying only those Jewish voices that served a denialist narrative, shamefully including, in the form of the likes of Shraga Stern, some of the most reactionary elements in Jewish life. A frequent refrain from opponents of anti-Semitism throughout the recent debates has been to, quote, "listen to Jews," end quote. Emphasizing the idea that people who experience oppression or persecution should be the ones to define that oppression, and ultimately that if a person from a marginalized group says an idea or action is, or conversely is not bigoted, they should be believed. Amplifying and centering the voices of people from marginalized groups in discussions about that marginalization is clearly vital. Quote, listen to Jews, end quote, is the beginning of good sense. But it cannot be the sum of good sense, given the obvious disagreements within, and indeed between, historically marginalized groups, including Jews, about their experiences. Without attempting to independently assess arguments on their substance, the exhortation to, quote, listen to Jews, end quote, cannot help anyone assess the conflicting arguments of Ephraim Mirvis and Shraga Stern, the numerous positions in between, and the entirely alternative arguments also from Jewish sources. If, quote, listen to Jews, end quote, as far as the discussion went, all we would be left with was a grubby game of tokenizing, selective philo-Semitic chess, where predominantly non-Jewish political factions wield, quote, their, end quote, respective Jewish tokens against each other. This is the game much of the left and the center/right within the Labour Party have played during recent years. It has added nothing to a serious understanding of anti-Semitism, except perhaps by providing an object lesson in how not to fight it. Some of the contradictions of this approach were highlighted by a 2018 video from Momentum, featuring an undoubtedly well-meaning representation from left-wing Jewish activist Tania Shu, giving her view on anti-Semitism on the left. In it, Tania Shu rightly argues that tackling anti-Semitism on the left can't be allowed to curtail freedom of speech, particularly for Palestinians. Tania Shu goes on to say that Palestinians have an absolute right to, quote, describe their oppression in whatever terms they see fit, end quote. On strict freedom of speech grounds, which are themselves no small matter, this is indisputable. But whether that means the, quote, terms, end quote, Palestinian or Jews, or anyone else, used to describe their experiences of oppression, cannot be challenged as another question. For example, the view that the oppression of the Palestinians is part of a world Zionist conspiracy by Jews to dominate others is an anti-Semitic calumny, whether it is uttered by a Palestinian or anyone else. They have a, quote, right, end quote, to say it, but to, quote, describe their oppression, end quote, they have a, quote, right, end quote, to say it, to, quote, describe their oppression, end quote, in such terms if they wish. But socialists also have a responsibility to challenge such, quote, terms, end quote. And, conversely, Jews have historically understood and described their oppression in all sorts of various different, quote, terms, some religiously rooted, some based on a variety of political analyses, and drawn vastly different conclusions from these various descriptions and understandings. Some Jews today see the Palestinian struggle for national liberation as inherently anti-Semitic, even claiming that the entire social construction of Palestinian national identity is anti-Jewish. A left that responds by saying, quote, all of these descriptions are equally valid, and it's not for anyone else to question the terms in which oppressed people describe their own oppression, end quote, will not be much use when it comes to confronting oppression or bigotry as it actually exists, end quote. Exists. Quote, listen to Palestinians, end quote, and, quote, listen to Jews, end quote, are necessary but not sufficient dictums for the left in the effort to arrive at comprehensive, historically rigorous analyses of Zionism, Israel-Palestine, and anti-Semitism that can inform effective socialist politics. The instruction to, quote, listen to, end quote, members of a group is intended to affirm the agency of that group, but it can also end up erasing that agency if it simply reduces the group to a politically undifferentiated, quote, flatland, end quote. Once you have listened, it is still incumbent upon you to process what you have listened to, bring the arguments into critical engagement with other arguments you have heard and read, and reach your own conclusions. The question, then, is how the left can engage with the political claims made by historically and currently marginalized communities about their marginalization, and how, where necessary, we can politically critique and contest those claims. That can only be done on the basis of sensitivity to and understanding of the history that shaped the identity from which those claims arise. Con Harris writes, quote, true anti-racism, ... requires fighting for the right of Jews to be Zionists, the rights of Muslims to be Islamists, and so on. That is the only way that there is even the slightest chance they will see their political choices as political choices, their foundational beliefs as politically contestable." End quote. In other words, sections of the left must abandon their demand of Jewish individuals and organizations that anti-Zionist political test be met as a precondition to being listened to, not automatically agreed with, but merely listened to, and not dismissed out of hand or automatically accused of ulterior motives, on the issue of the bigotry they face in society. This makes leftist solidarity against anti-Semitism conditional on prior political agreement with leftist common sense, an approach that can neither build a robust movement against bigotry nor stand any chance of persuading a significant number of Jews to become organized socialist activists. Worse still, when sections treat Zionism as a quote flatland end quote or quote seamless whole end quote, functioning as a reified network project for political domination, capable of manipulating the domestic politics of any state, they designate the majority of Jews as the enemy. If such things as David Miller's uncritical republication of writings by the neo-Nazi Kevin MacDonald are anything to go by, this thinking can lead its adherents into some extremely ugly places. The left, if we aspire to genuine egalitarianism and anti-racism, has a responsibility to relate sensitively to anxieties within Jewish communities about anti-Semitism and within other historically and currently marginalized and oppressed communities about bigotries they face. Conspiracy mongering, the presumption of ulterior motives, and vicarious identitarian and communalist approaches must all give way to a working-class anti-racism that stands with minority communities, whatever their hegemonic politics, against racism and bigotry, but also understands those communities as sites of struggles in which the left should seek to intervene. If we cannot do that, we risk abdicating both our responsibility to seriously and critically analyze the world around us and basic duties of solidarity. The end. Thank you for listening. The next chapter is chapter 7, and it's titled Left Anti-Semitism, Racism, and Depression.